Many of us, including garden enthusiasts, admire a beautiful yard or garden. Yet they're not always sure what makes one landscape stand out from another. I'm quite sure the professionals are probably taught specifics that they adopt and likely with a fair amount of success. My education is a little different. It's observational and from trial and error. Opinion, an absolute must in a home garden is edging. A deep edge creates defined lines, pleasant curves, weed inhibition, and keeps flowers and grass in check. There are many ways to create an edge, all of which work with varying results. If I owned a money tree, I'd probably edge every inch of my yard with beautiful stone. Since I don't have a money tree, I instead reshape the existing lawn and landscape with a shovel and sweat equity. In my opinion, I believe that a 90-degree edge looks the best. It's backbreaking work, so oftentimes either you or your landscaper ends up creating an edge or edges that look like ski slopes instead of those nice sheer cliffs. It's unfortunately physically more demanding to create a steep edge, so oftentimes you or your landscaper ends up with a bunny slope instead. There are a number of effective ways to accomplish a 90-degree angle on the landscape edge. I've created a way that works very well for me, and hopefully it will do the same for you. You'll see in my landscape that I already have edges, and so it may look like I'm not showing the full job. However, you can very much do the same thing even if you're starting from scratch. I just wanted to give you a look at this edge again. It's not done and it needs mulch and some final touches. However, it gives you an indication of what it will look like when it's done. This bed here that we're coming up to hasn't been done yet, and although it doesn't look terrible, that's mostly because I've been doing this process for the last few years, and I make sure that my edges are very, very deep. Therefore, each year it's a little less work. Okay, it's time to make this bed look like this bed. Now again, this is prior to getting mulch on there, so it's anything but a finished product, but it obviously gives you an indication. This one here, time for a little cleanup. You can use a spade or a straight shovel if you prefer. I just use a regular one. The one I use here is heavy and it's got some notches on the bottom that help dig. It's a little bit more work because of its heaviness. However, I find that it's more effective for cutting through roots and things of that nature. The edge here is probably, excuse me, a good 4 inches deep, give or take. And so you can see that the amount of soil that I'm shoveling in mulch obviously doesn't equate to that much. I can assure you that when I first started doing this, it was a lot more work and a lot more wheelbarrow fulls of soil. But after that first couple years, each year will be more like what I'm doing here. Also, last year we had a very big drought, and probably the worst drought since I've been gardening. And as a result, the grass went dormant. A lot of the flowers and plants, shrubs even, for the first time, just weren't doing great. So I didn't want to spend the money on doing a full mulch job. So essentially, I probably have about 20-25% of the mulch that I normally do. The bad news is it didn't look great for obvious reasons. And the good news is I'm shoveling a lot less this year. Each year I rake and shovel last year's mulch out of the shrub beds with the intent of recycling it for future use. In the past, I would put it in the compost bin, but I found a better use for it now. Today's repurpose is that I use that as a thin top coat on my garden beds, specifically my perennial beds, not for annuals and not the shrub beds. Mulch is definitely an old garden nemesis of mine. A love-hate relationship. Mulching is like getting your car detailed. It looks unbelievable on day one and a little worse each day thereafter. one of the perceived benefits of mulch is weed suppression. I'm sure that in a laboratory setting this is definitely true. However, out here in the wild, for every weed suppressed, you get 2 or 3 more growing on the top of your mulch. I've used pre-emergent weed killers, Roundup, second application of mulch, raking, hand pulling, you name it. I mean, they all help, but in the end, weeds reign supreme, and you just have to keep fighting the good fight. Without a doubt, an unspoken problem with using mulch for weed suppression is that it also suppresses just about everything else. The most obvious example of this, for me, was my black-eyed Susans. For many years, I had mounds of them. However, after a number of very successful seasons, the number of plants just seemed to mysteriously decrease. I finally figured out that, well, I was mulching just around the time that the black-eyed Susans and many of my flowers and plants needed more sun, not less. So essentially, I was obstructing the flourishing of my new flowers when I thought I was just, killing weeds or keeping weeds down. What that did was it made it so that way only the older, well-rooted plants would survive. Well, that's good news to some degree, but as those got old and tired, I was left with less and less each year. When developing different edging ideas, it dawned on me, instead of raking out and composting last year's mulch, I could repurpose it by applying a very thin coat in my perennial gardens. Not in my shrub beds, not in my annual gardens. So I do this in mid-March while it's still cold. There's basically nothing coming out of the ground or very little emerging flowers or plants. This top coat is definitely not for aesthetics because it doesn't look good. And it's definitely not for weed suppression because it's a very thin coat. The mulch is old and ugly, so it's for moisture retention only. It's tough to keep plants thriving without moisture retention. Or, even more difficult, is to keep them thriving when smothered under 3 to 4 inches of mulch. I found that a light top coating of last year's mulch very early in the season is a perfect solution for your perennial beds. So the raking there was to kind of make the bed look a little bit nicer, but it was also to rake the mulch onto that patch right there of black-eyed Susans. And that's what I was doing as well when I was throwing some mulch out of the wheelbarrow, just trying to get it all in there just for a little suppression. This bed is just about done. When I built this wall, I built that kind of window box in the middle there on purpose. So I did a double side so that way I could plant flowers in there, and I filled it with soil. The bad news is each year the soil just seems to kind of sink into the ground. So a trick that I learned is in some of my shrub beds where I have more soil than mulch, what I'll do is any areas that need either to be filled in like this, or if I'm going to create a bed for a new garden, I'll use this as a base layer. So I did part of it already, you could probably see at the beginning, but the wall's probably 50 feet long, and what I'll do is I'll fill all of that in, and then where the gargoyle is, I just put the mulch. You can see I put some mulch, just a thin coat on that right side. Left side's going to be next, and I try not to put too much soil in there just so that way I don't get too many weeds intermingled. And then here, I don't care what is, whether there's weeds or not, because I'm going to put annuals in there. And as a result, I'll make sure I kind of am constantly weeding it. But you can see I've got a good 40 feet left of wall to do. All right, this wall's all done. You can see the soil looks pretty good. Basically, I just kind of level it off like flour with my hands, and then I just rake it in. And then when I plant the flowers, I use some good compost with the flowers just to make sure. All right, time to go to another section of the yard and rinse and repeat. I did start a little bit here, but I just wanted to kind of give you a little view, even though this bottom section here that I'm about to show you isn't really looking great yet. I started it, and it's a little worse for the wear just because it's wet, so it's a little harder work, but we'll make sure it looks great. Okay, finished product time. And, not for the whole yard or anything silly, but we did finish the backyard, at least for the edging. And it looks like my dog Amber finished that tennis ball. Yeah, she definitely finished that. I did some weeding, so I did some weeding, in all the locations. So there may be a couple other piles. I do recommend that you do some weeding as well. Also, one of the things that I recommend is make sure that you weed whack if you are so inclined, or if you have a landscaper, have them do it. But you don't have to do anything to the edges if you're going to weed whack. If you're not going to, I think you should get rid of the burrs with a spade or something similar. When we get down here, you'll see that little black-eyed Susan patch right here. I always put fertilizer down first in any of the garden areas. So there's a slow release fertilizer there, and then I put that thin coat of mulch on top for the moisture retention. I did the same thing here, so I made sure I put slow release fertilizer everywhere. This is all black-eyed Susans as well, and some coreopsis, a couple other things here or there, but make sure, again, that thin coat is only for moisture, not to look pretty, not to keep weeds down. This here I just filled up some soil because it wasn't completely full last year, and so it is now. The wall looks great, other than these little dings right here and a couple little not so great areas. But I built the wall with a friend of mine over 20 years ago, and maybe 25 years ago. And neither of us knew anything about it. He certainly was a lot more handy than I, but we got it done, and I think it looks nice right now. And we're going to fill that with some annuals this year. And the soil itself, I'm not worried about whether it's got great nutrition or not, because I always put compost in with my annuals when I plant them. This area, right here, you can see some of the burrs. I definitely need to weed whack and clean that up a little. You can also see that there was a sprinkler line there. Be careful that you don't nick the sprinkler lines. It'll cost you money or time or both. I tend to do it every couple of years, and I'm never happy. So this all looks, pretty good. You can see it's still a little damp and whatever, and you can see got some snow left over, but maybe just a couple days and that'll be gone. Another sprinkler line there. So when you go down deep, it shows you that when those irrigation guys put it in, they don't always put it as deep as they should. And so we're all but done for the backyard, but the side yards have a ton of work to be done, as do the front yard. So probably 30% done, and that's a good start. Listen, I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and hopefully it was maybe gave you a couple ideas. All right, thank you very much.